International relations in a digital world. How are political decisions influenced by the new media landscape and an interactive society? Media and foreign policy in the digital age. The subject up for debate at the Deutsche Welle Global Media Forum 2015. From the 22nd to the 24th of June in Bonn.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the plenary session of the Global Media Forum. Hope you had a great day so far. It's certainly been an action-packed day. Distinguished speakers from the public and private sector, the live launch of DW's new 24-hour English news service, and of course the many workshops and panels digging deep into some really hard-hitting questions about foreign policy in the digital age. And it's far from over. In this closing session, journalists are often criticized for abandoning the war zone when the fighting dies down, or when new conflicts flare up somewhere else. It's a criticism we heard earlier with our first panel on the topic, if it bleeds, it leads. So how do we go about reporting on post-conflict societies and frozen conflicts? Daniel Gerlach will be moderating this session. He's the editor of Zenith magazine and a Middle East analyst that it has been my great pleasure to have many times on the set at DW News for some great conversations. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Daniel Gerlach.
Good evening, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for attending this closing session today. Just one word. If either of you have ever heard of a Facebook gender equality group called Congratulations, You Have an All-Male Panel. If either of you are members of this group, take your shot, tweet it now, and then listen to what these gentlemen have to say. Okay? To atone this gender equality sin that we are all committing here, we promise that if the weather is better tonight, we might perform as a boy group with the band on the steamship. That's a surprise to my distinguished guests here. Thank you very much. We will be covering an issue, a topic that has been touched on many times today, as Brian said before. And we have a very global panel of people that unite three qualities, let's say, in journalism. They have regional expertise, they have a theoretical background. Some of them are not only journalists, but also, as I can use that word, activists in a certain way. We will learn more about what kind of activism they perform. And they also have a theoretical background, but also practical experience as reporters on the ground, from frozen conflicts and conflict zones, post-conflict societies, and I think we will all very thoroughly discuss the value of this terminology today. To my very right is Markus Bensmann, who is one of the editors and directors of Korrektiv. Reporter, sorry. My first mistake tonight. And Markus, I will tell you what Korrektiv is. It's the first German NGO-based unit on conflict reporting that pursues an idea that journalism today is actually not necessarily a market asset or something that you trade, but that it needs NGO support and it needs funds, and they do investigative research, investigative reporting. In Markus' case, especially on Central Asia, Caucasus, Eastern Europe. And they don't sell their results, they don't sell what they produce, but they decide on respective partners with whom they share this information, and they broadcast it. Markus has worked in Central Asia, as I said, in the Caucasus region. He speaks perfect, at least fluent Russian, as I heard before, and he's from Düsseldorf originally, and he's worked for several German newspapers before. Next to him is Denis Dzidic from Bosnia and Herzegovina, from Sarajevo. Denis specializes on transitional justice issues in Bosnia, and he's the member of the Investigative Reporting Network. He has spent a lot of time in The Hague also, following very closely the war crimes tribunals on the Balkan Wars. And yeah, I'm very happy to have you here. Cheang Sokha from Phnom Penh, from Cambodia. He works for the PPP, for the Phnom Penh Post, which is the oldest English language newspaper in Phnom Penh in Cambodia. And he covers, he's the chief of staff, editorial chief of staff of this newspaper, and he mainly covers also topics on transitional justice in Phnom Penh, especially the Khmer Rouge trials, which of course all of you have heard of, but we don't follow it very closely all the time. So I think you took a long travel. Thank you very much, Cheang, for coming this way. To my left is Dana Asaad from Suleimania in Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan. He was born in Kirkuk, the city of Kirkuk, which is somehow a micro-Iraq, and which unites all the frozen and hot conflicts of this country. He's currently directing the Media Academy in Suleimania. He has worked extensively, of course, on Daesh, on the Islamic State, and the events that are now dominating our news broadcasting. And to his left, Asiem El Difraoui, who is a political scientist, but also an awarded journalist who has worked in Iraq and Bosnia. He has not taken part, but followed hot conflicts for many years. But at the same time, he's a political analyst who specializes in jihadi propaganda. Not only of the Islamic State, but of Al-Qaeda. He started working on this topic long before. And one of his specialties is jihadi propaganda on the internet. And he got his PhD from Sciences Po in Paris on this subject, where he's also currently teaching. But he is also working as a media analyst in this field. So thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we will, as usual, have Jakov, who will receive some treats either from you or from the world out there. You're very warmly invited to participate in this debate later on. I want to open, as it's become a tradition, I think, in these panels here, I want to open with a quote from Robert Capa. I don't have to tell you who that person was, who said, "As a war photographer, I prefer to be unemployed, to remain unemployed until the rest of my life." We all talked about wars, we talked about violence, and if I can say that, sexiness of violence in news broadcasts, and also the dominating factor of violence in our news. We have heard many interesting, also the aspect of peace journalism was addressed today, and of course we are going to talk about this, but what we really want to focus on is the question, is the journalistic dilemma. When we cover a conflict or a post-conflict society or a frozen conflict, do we make things worse by calling problems by the name? We have, all of us as journalists have been certainly accused by powerful stakeholders of incitement, of, in the Middle Eastern case, for example, like inciting sectarian violence by calling sectarian conflicts by its name, and the tradition of peace journalism emerged from anti-sectarianism. It emerged from a Christian concept, so to say, that journalists could play a role, as a constructive role or a mitigating, moderating role in conflicts, and not to make things worse. And my question today is, can we play this role? Don't we act out of character if we try to positively influence the subject that we are reporting about? Dana and Asiem, a year ago, quite precisely a year ago, the Islamic State declared a caliphate, which was big news. A couple of weeks ago, they had conquered or taken over the city of Mosul in the north of Iraq. It came as a big surprise to many. Did it surprise you? And why was it such a surprise for the media world?
Thank you, Daniel. So, like I believe having the Islamic State or Daesh or whatever around Mosul, and in such like provinces such as Anbar, Fallujah and others, it's not a shock, it's not surprising for us, especially in Iraq. But I believe these domino effects of falling down cities one after one in a couple of days, and then you suddenly find a new neighbor which is controlling almost 1/3 of the country in a couple of days. This was the surprising thing. But having ISIS, or even before like Qaeda in Iraq or in the area, it's not new for us, but maybe this is what the international media don't focus on, which we call it the post-conflict. It's not that interesting for them. Usually they jump in when there's a conflict there. So maybe this is the reason behind being a bit, surprising to have ISIS there for you.
We were looking at a frozen conflict that exploded in our face. There was a conflict which first was frozen and then turned into a total meltdown. Was this, Asim, a frozen conflict? Is this an example for a frozen conflict that we didn't?
I'm generally a little unhappy with the term of a frozen conflict. A frozen conflict is a term, which simplifies matter to a degree where it gets really worrisome, which also shows that we are not looking at societies with our short-term media or other memory. Where is a conflict frozen? Either it's in a society where the conflict is still present, in a sense that there's very negative societal dynamics, which not openly explode for a couple of years, or we are in a society at transition, in transition to more peaceful society, and then it's not a frozen conflict, then it's a transition process which we need to accompany also as media. So the question about frozen conflicts in our short-term memory leads to much wider questions, the attention span of media. We said early on we wouldn't mention anecdotes in the sense of what we have experienced personally in conflicts, but I'll tell another anecdote. I was, when Daesh took over Mosul and the Caliphate declared, a book of mine about Egypt was published in France. I went to a radio station and to talk about this book about Egypt. So the presenter said, sorry Asim, we can't talk about Egypt now. Can you speak 25 minutes about Daesh? So today we have Egypt out of focus, while Daesh takes over all our attention, and places like Egypt are really undercovered. And I mean, everybody knows that Egypt doesn't do very well at this stage, and we might have a really disruptive situation in Egypt, even some bread revolution and so on. So there's really, firstly, a progress on journalistic focus. We run after the news, we don't do permanent coverage of places which are still potentially very dangerous and which might explode from one minute to the other. And then again, as you mentioned, there's this whole debate about constructive journalism. I wouldn't call it peace journalism, but journalism here is one of the really rare places where grassroots journalism is promoted, where countries are trying to be followed on the long run, but mainstream journalism doesn't do that anymore. So we're crucially lacking today information about places which might literally, as we have seen with Mosul, or generally like the Sunnite areas of Iraq, explode from one minute to the other.
When was the last time before the declaration of the Caliphate, or let's say before the takeover of Mosul, that you have been asked on a primetime news show in France, because Asim talks a lot to the French mainstream media, as you just said. Let's question that term later. When was the last time that you were asked information about an Islamic State in Iraq? A movement called the Islamic State in Iraq that existed well before?
No, never asked a question, but it's even worse. Like we were suggesting, it's really suggesting to German news channels to look at, not French only, to German news channels, to look closely at Iraq, because me and some other analysts felt it was an explosive situation. And one of the answers, when I told them to concentrate on a couple of areas which we deemed important, they said, oh, this was a German government channel, said, well, that is rather too complex. We want to do interesting news which fit into clear analytical patterns. And that's what's happening. I mean, nobody was interested in Iraq. If we today suggest some in-depth coverage of, for example, Egypt, we'll get basically the same result. So we'll just be focusing on headline news again, which is a real shame. But what struck me most was, for example, everybody was talking then in France about Daesh, 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 and Islamic State, which dominated the prime time. And then finally, when the attacks came against Charlie Hebdo in France and against the Jewish supermarket, it turned out to be Al-Qaeda, which is a very good example for our short-term memory. We focus on an issue, and we don't go into long-term depths.
So it's not that we want to, lament about that we don't get enough space in news broadcasts, but that underreporting of such frozen conflicts or conflict zones can really have dangerous consequences, because the attention is lacking, and when the attention is lacking, the conflict is kind of smoldering. It's continuing. Cheang and Denis, you both work on subjects that I think for as Asiem said, for our short-time news oriented memory, are solved. If not solved, they're over. Cheang, you're working on the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge, still the word sounds terrifying, but it's a long time ago that the Khmer Rouge massacres and detention camps and so on dominated the news. Actually, it was back in the 1970s even. Denis, the Balkan Wars, the war in Bosnia, after the Dayton Agreement, somehow seemed over, at least for most news broadcasters. You both work on transitional justice. Maybe, Cheang, you first. Why is it still important today to, give news time and to explain these Khmer Rouge tribunals? And what is the controversy in your own country about it? What are you, what challenges are you also facing when you explain to people in your country that you are still touching on the old wounds and you don't just let it go and you don't look forward to the future?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, it's still very important to continue to cover the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, even it is over 30 years so far that happened in 1970 to 75. What we are interested to cover is that to follow the regime at the time is about the how the policy of the regime to kill 2 million of innocent people that the regime a lot of people that has been killed, and so far even is the trial, the tribunal set up since 2006, a joint set up between Cambodian government and the UN. Those of the leader of the regime are still not revealed. What is the policy that make a lot of people killed, and especially the eviction people from the city to the countryside, that and killing of intellectual. That is the still a question that we want to know, and especially the family of the victim who the loved members were killed at that time are still waiting for justice, or want to see what is going on with the tribunal at the end. Despite those two, now we have the court has convicted 3 defendants, one in 2010 and 2 just in 2014 last year. But a lot of things still behind that, and those even they are convicted, but they never confess the crime. Only one. The guy who was a lower official that just received the order from the decision maker. He just revealed something, but it's not what is behind that we want to know about the truth of the regime.
So you consider Cambodia, your country, a post-conflict society. Let me challenge you here. What ethical justification as a journalist do you have, and how do you also tell that story to your audience, why this is important, why you're insisting on this, and what might be happening? I invite you to speculate. If we don't report about this situation anymore, if we don't look at the past, what could be the future challenges?
It is the history for Cambodia, and the people are still really want to know and follow up all the this process of the court while the court still continue. So that is why we have to try to dig up every single point of the regime to reveal and telling people what is going on.
Same situation for you?
Yeah, exactly. And when you look at Bosnia and Herzegovina, you really don't have to speculate what would happen if you don't systematically deal with the past, if you don't write about it, if you don't go through like determining the truth, and the media plays a big role in that. Like if you look at our history, you have the Balkans where you have World War I, you have World War II, you have the recent wars. It's every 40 years. And let me tell you, like we're in the courtrooms every day, people from BIRN, and a lot of these stories about trials, you hear the same pattern again and again. You know, these people came into our village and they said like, this is payback for World War II. And this is the issue, like if you don't deal with these things, if they're not in the media, they're not dealt with at all, then you literally will have history repeating itself.
Okay, but at the same time, you work for an NGO, of course, like somebody is looking after your funding, somebody is supporting your activity. How do the other journalists, the other colleagues who work for commercially funded or private media, do they feel that this is still an issue for the public? Is the public still interested in that?
They don't have to feel it. It's not something that they have to try very hard. We are living in Bosnia and Herzegovina in not even a post-conflict society, in a currently conflict society. There's just no war going on. But everything about the issues that Bosnia is facing is connected to the war in one way or another, and everything goes back to that. So it's literally an issue every day, and it's an issue now, it's an issue through every single thing that we are trying to achieve. So it's not a big issue for you to force this issue on mainstream media. It's there in our region, in Bosnia and in our region. The problem is that it's not in the mainstream media. You mentioned something that it's forgotten, and I totally agree with that. When we try to make our stories, you know, to write for a global audience, then we are forced to oversimplify issues because they want to fit it in a very simple narrative. We're approaching 20 years from Srebrenica, and what I've heard repeatedly from journalists coming to do features is, you know, I want to do a feel-good story like this crime has been prosecuted, has been called genocide, and Bosnia is now in peace, and that's the story they want, and not the real story, and that's an issue.
Marcus, the term frozen conflict was somehow invented for the part of the world that you have been reporting on, that you're still reporting on, Central Asia, post-Soviet states, post-Soviet societies, and then the Caucasus. Now we are facing a different geopolitical landscape, a lot of controversy between, for example, like Russian media and Western and also Ukrainian media on the conflicts in Eastern Europe. The same account certainly for the Caucasus and Central Asia, even though we don't read and hear so much about it in our news. I'm trying to give you a map actually that's going to work, that we can see like what countries Marcus is working on, because I'm not so sure if all of you are familiar with these countries. This is the Middle East, as you can see. Okay, at least we have Central Asia, with the Caucasus, yeah. So when you work in that part of the world, you told me in our prep talk that these frozen conflicts remain there, and they remain there for a reason. And journalists that are trying to investigate the problems, the underlying patterns of this conflict are not welcome. So you speak Russian, but as a German journalist, you travel to these countries and you're trying to investigate ethnic troubles and contention between, let's say, Kyrgyz and Uzbeks and other ethnic minorities. Like, are you often confronted with the reproach that you should not be here? You should not make things worse than they already are. You should not tell people that there is problems between Uzbeks and Kyrgyz, and that you should be constructive in a more constructive way.
In the end, I think that is a use of censorship too, to prevent journalists from reporting of what happened on the ground. And from 5 countries which we see between Caspian Sea and China's border, I'm kicked out of 3, and in one country considered as information terrorists. But the situation is, we are not the problems going to the spots and see it. The problem is inside, it's in these frozen conflicts. And we can see after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this frozen conflicts from the Pamir Mountains to Transnistria to Europe is used by Russia to control these former republics. And it's very interesting, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think 2 bodies survived. That is the Secret Service and that is the criminal world. And in every frozen conflict, 2 of these bodies playing somehow a part in this. And therefore it's very important that we watch at it. Because this body, OSCE for example, which has a duty or the idea to solve this problem or help, to assist to help this problem, they failed 20 years after that.
I still don't understand. Can we have the microphone for Dr. Asiem El Difraoui, please?
I still don't really understand what a frozen conflict is. For me, there is no frozen conflict.
Okay, I agree with you. This word frozen conflict is not true because the people living in this conflict suffering the consequences of the conflict every day. But for example, I will give you an example. Before the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had ethnic clashes in Osh. The Uzbek and the Kyrgyz killed each other.
Can you tell our audience, I don't know how many Central Asian colleagues we have here, where Osh is. I think it's important.
It's a south city of Kyrgyzstan. And then after these horrible things, burning houses, 20 years was nothing. And people even didn't speak about it. Everybody wanted to ignore it. And out of the sudden, 2010, the same thing happened again, out of a sudden. That thousands of Kyrgyz went through the neighborhoods, the Uzbek neighborhoods, and burned the cities down. That means 20 years was a conflict in a city which was neglected and erupted again. And that maybe could be seen as a frozen conflict, but I agree with you, a frozen conflict is always day-to-day suffered by people living in there. It's better maybe a forgotten conflict.
So
I think we should agree on forgotten conflicts.
Forgotten by whom? Is violence an issue? Does a frozen conflict need violence? Also to attract your attention?
For media attention, maybe, yeah, then you can really see the consequences. But I think the consequences, for example, you have an enclave, yeah, in South Kyrgyzstan. This enclave belonged to Uzbekistan, but the people living inside are Tajik. That the people living in the enclave are not able to go to university anymore. They are not able to establish a statehood. They are not able to travel. And they are having daily problems. And if it's so difficult to, for example, to pitch this kind of story, but out of a sudden, this kind of things can explode.
Dana, in Iraq, you must have witnessed a similar situation about everyday troubles and everyday conflicts that were probably the result of governance problems, of deliberate oppression. Would you say that we wouldn't be in the situation in Iraq, we wouldn't see that escalation of violence if we had paid more attention? Yeah. And what would an accurate reporting about on these processes have contributed to the better of the situation?
I think I'm not the right person to be involved in this discussion. Like, I'm 36 years old from Iraq, and I don't remember that I went through a post-conflict period. Like, all my life been in conflicts and crises, and after that, the other. I think we have lots of problems when it comes to cover the conflict itself in Iraq. And even if we have this short time of going through this post-conflict, if I can call it, we are not doing it in the proper way as journalists.
Can you tell us what exactly are these problems? we're among colleagues here. Everybody, almost everybody, is a professional journalist in this room. What are the specific problems on dealing with this situation?
Okay, we have to talk about then before and after 2003. Before 2003, we had like few media outlets. You can count it in the fingers on of your hands. And it was like the media of the Ba'athist regime, like one color, one opinion, one ideology. There we didn't have really a media, if I can say. After 2003, suddenly hundreds of media outlets came out. Every single political party, and even inside the political parties, every single officials had his own media. Like we are talking about suddenly in a couple of months, hundreds of TVs, radios, online, like websites and so on. But we didn't have journalists. So journalism actually in Iraq became job for the jobless people. I mean, you feel all those media outlets whose people who they have no background about journalism, and they know nothing about ethics of journalism, and those people, unfortunately, started to cover the post-conflict time.
But that's one of the sources of contention here. I mean, Asiem mentioned the concept of grassroots journalism. Okay. You said, okay, that's probably a solution.
Two types of journalism. That means the journalist local inside the conflict, yeah, as you're telling. If after the Ba'ath regime, how it's for me not a wonder that you do not have journalists on the ground, yeah, from where they should appear. But then we have also journalists, the international media, which coming in, which covering the media, and I think there's two different groups. Because
yes, they really need to differentiate it. But the Iraqi example is very important for the role of foreign media in terms of the coverage of the conflict, because as you just mentioned, all the Iraqi journalism, despite some trainings through a lot of German institutions, were hardline party propagandists or sectarian propagandists. There was very little independent journalism. It was just opinion journalism serving different parties, which partly exaggerated conflicts. And then, if there is no international coverage of Iraq, the Iraqis don't get any kind of unbiased information. And there we have a collective responsibility, especially in those countries which are not post-conflict, just in our perception post-conflict, which are still in conflict, where you have a totally biased and polarizing press. Those countries need our coverage, and they need independent information sources, and they don't need 1 year attention span, but a permanent, continuous coverage, which includes specialists from this country, which know this country well, and which would report continuously on general developments.
Okay, and here we have a big issue. In war times, we assume that all parties try to influence the discourse, of course. They try to dominate through propaganda. But that also happens in frozen conflicts and also happens in post-conflict societies. And it's probably much more subtle and much more difficult to deal with, because in war times people are aware of the fact that propaganda is a weapon of war. So, Denis, from your experience, stakeholders, political stakeholders, are trying to influence your work probably every day.
Yeah, this is clearly visible. For instance, when you look at the media ownership structure, they are almost entirely either completely owned by either the government or political parties, or they're so closely affiliated to them that they might as well be the owners. So you can clearly, visibly see them enhancing the conflict in this post-conflict reality. You can literally
but how
see...
How is that possible? Bosnia was quoted as such a fantastic example. We were all very hopeful about it, and even the experts in the late 1990s or early 2000s said Bosnia is going to do well. How did that end up so dramatically in the media landscape?
I think part of the problem is that Bosnia had done so well for a period of about 10 years, where you had very strong international presence. I'm not talking just about media, but also the Office of the High Representative was quite very willing to use powers to push the country forward. And then in about 2008, they stopped and they said, okay, now it's the time for Bosnians to agree on things on their own. And they pulled back. And since our peace agreement contains our constitution, nobody is really willing or interested, because we have the same political elites that we had before the war now. Nobody's really interested in fixing the situation and making it better, because that would literally mean them losing power. So basically, you don't have progress because you don't have incentive for progress.
Same situation in Iraq? Well, let's rephrase it this way. Is it more difficult to fend off the influence of different political stakeholders who are trying to influence the way that journalists are reporting in post-conflict societies than it is in societies at war?
No, absolutely. Because of the media outlets are I can say more than 95% of the media outlets run by political parties and run by political parties fund and money. Journalists are kind of just getting orders to do the job. Even the coverage is coming from how those political and what the ideology behind the media outlets want. This is how they work, and this is why I want to add this, if you don't mind. This is why lots of in general, our coverage for the Islamic states is not in the proper way. Most of the time in Iraq and in general, in Iraq, the journalists kind of stoking the fire, and they are having negative effect on the conflict itself.
You said the journalists are stoking the fire. That's a strong word.
Unfortunately, yeah. I mean, let's have this example. If we talk
because this sounds like any politician or government official that doesn't like critical press coverage would say the journalists are stoking the fire. We've heard that. You have to elaborate on that.
The journalists right now, they are working in Sunni media outlets or Shi'i media outlets. So the elegance, unfortunately, it's always for the ethnic groups, for the sectarian groups. It's not like a national one. I want to have this example about when it comes to the coverage of ISIS, because we are covering it through sectarian media outlets, through sectarian TVs. We only cover this, which I can call it the tips of the iceberg. We only see this violent, evil part of the Islamic State, and we ignore this huge part which is not visible. This is one of the biggest mistakes which we are doing in Iraq, covering ISIS in a way which exactly ISIS itself wants from us. And this, again, because it's coming from the sectarian background of the conflict.
Okay, Asiem, you suggest as a solution to this problem, grassroots journalism?
I think I'll try to frame this a little differently. So we're basically confronted with two problems, with two enormous set of challenges. For the region we are concerned mostly with, as Middle Eastern specialists, we have a multiplication of conflicts, a dramatic multiplication of conflicts. And we have a media revolution. Let's call it the Web 2.0 revolution, or whatever you call it. So the media is developing so rapidly that media itself poses as unknown challenges, because this media is used in these conflicts as very dangerous instruments. We had these Arab revolutions, or the hopeful beginning of Arab uprisings in Egypt and Tunisia, where this Web 2.0 revolution and the cross-media implications were used in a very positive way for what we call disproportional resource mobilization. Now we see other people using this media for the same resource mobilization, recruitment, financing, ever, but they're not people who want to create a better Middle East, but have very strong, powerful interests, sectarian interests, and whatever. So there's a huge domestic challenge in terms of media uses over there, which we need to counterbalance with our media. How do we do that? And that's the biggest issue. So we're going much beyond about classical concepts about peace journalism, which have been discussed here. The multiplication of concepts and the media revolution together will be a huge challenge. How will we respond to it? And this is one of the concrete questions. This in turn implies that we need to look concretely at the different countries, at media ownership patterns in the different countries, media usage patterns, and the societal structures of these countries in conflict. So we're just beyond huge challenges, and I don't have any kind of even simple answer to that.
One word about media ownership, Cheang. Your newspaper, I mentioned it's the oldest English language newspaper in Cambodia. Who owns it? Is it a government stakeholder? Is it a political party? Or who is the owner of your newspaper?
Actually, my newspaper was set up by the American journalists since 1992. But since 1992, he ran until 2008. He was transferred to the Australian businessman. So our newspaper is completely private, independently private.
Does that mean, honestly, of course, this is a live broadcast, does it mean that because it's private, it's more independent, or?
Of course, yes, private is so? More, because in my country, they have a classify of type of media. Because we are very few media organizations that are independent. But most of them, most of the other media are like a friendly media with the government. So they never report any thing that criticize anything that involved with the corruption activity of the government official or anything. But we.
So in what way is your government trying to influence your reporting? Is it like, don't emphasize too much the past, don't talk too much about the past? Do they suggest that you should report in a certain way? Are they trying to influence your channel of information, the material you use for your reporting?
That is the government. Of course, they try to do that with our media. But since we are independently and we don't have received any fund from the government, we are run separately. So we just do our own professional. And the government, of course, try to influence with the other media who aligns with the government that not to reporting anything that could cause the insulting or incitement or anything bad. Or they don't want to look back at the history that could, cause the country or something. Even like at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, even they have agreement between the United Nations and the government to run it, but the government still, try to interfere, try to put influence into the UN side, so that the further case that the international side want to dig up more and more, to find more and more people involved, responsible for the crime or for the next case, but the government tries to, to block.
Asiem just mentioned that the role of foreign international media in Iraq. A question to all of you. Do you think that international news broadcasters, NGO-funded investigative journalism initiatives, private media, local media, who can do the better job on this?
It was a very interesting moment. We have these local medias in a conflict zone, which often part of a conflict party, or if we see, for example, the Russian media that are not journalists anymore, that are information warriors. And in this moment, I think we should stick to our approaches of journalism, of our ethics, and then cooperate with the local media, because the local media, they have one big advantage. They have a knowledge, they have a network, but they're under the threat to be used to be sold, to be part. And only, I think, a constant cooperation with an international media, which is not a propaganda voice, but is sticking to the ethnic of journalism. We shouldn't be under this pressure of this, or accusing of the mainstream media or Lügenpresse in Germany. Yeah? We should really say there is a difference between this Russian information war and our journalism. We should be proud of it. But we really should go back to these local medias and strengthen a cooperation.
So,
Daniel raised this very important question. I mean, we have representatives from 3 continents here. One who lives in a post-conflict society, or 2, let's eventually, post-conflict, and you live in a conflict society. What is the role of international media? How do you perceive the role of the international media, and what's the influence?
Actually, as I mentioned in the beginning, the international media usually care about interesting in the conflict itself. Like always, we say it like a joke. Journalists talk to each other. You say, "I have a good news. What happens? 50% got killed, for instance." So this is what the international media try to cover. They don't interest in the post-conflict period. Right now, because of the coverage of the media for the crisis, for the conflict in Iraq, it's we cannot say any longer it's Iraqi, the fight between Iraq and the Islamic State. It's almost going to be a Sunni-Shi'i fight. And because of this coverage, we are pushing lots of young, frustrated, disconnected young people to join this fight, to join this conflict, and from the both sides, because the problem is when we cover the conflict, we look at it like unfortunately the forces from both sides, like they are dogmatic forces, and even our coverage is kind of the same. So we push the people to join the both sides. Even if we talk about the international media, I mean, since June last year until now, like hundreds of Daeshi fighters jump into Iraq and Syria with European passports.
But, okay, we can talk about that blaming game. The joke that you just told is very emblematic in a way, because as much as you accuse the mainstream international media of applying cliches about the situation and about simplifying, you're doing the same thing about the international media. I mean, is it really their fault? Is it really their responsibility? What would you suggest? A news piece about clashes between Sunnis and Shiite militias in a province in Iraq, would you just say 2 Iraqi groups of different social and religious backgrounds have clashed? I mean, how do you solve that?
What Dana is saying, is a very, very valid point. This is factual. He's not accusing the media intentionally. He's saying there's a structural bias, as we only report when 50 Sunnis die or 50 Shiites die. Those information polarizes those 2 camps. This is not even intentionally, it's a structural bias.
And can you explain the concept of this structural bias a bit more, like this, focusing on violence more, on event more than on the process? That could be
again what we do, and what has been said this afternoon, blood cells. So in the structural bias, news are only newsworthy if there's a lot of blood. A lot of blood in the country incites other people to revenge, to choose one's camp, and so on, instead of continuous coverage, which, for instance, could show which people share in common, or the common suffering. This is this huge media bias which exacerbates conflicts much too often.
Yeah, but
I think Dana wanted to
not reporting then, if this kind of things happen, that 50 people are killed. Should we say, okay, it's too dangerous, we are not reporting then?
No, we shouldn't only report that. As mentioned earlier, we should do continuous reporting on those issues. And I think it's a huge challenge for the press, and maybe it's a failure of European or Western media that, again, the attention span is so short that we don't cover Iraq. I mean, a lot of us have been here during the Iraq War, have been there 2003 and until 2006, where there was a huge media hype. Suddenly this media hype vanishes, and then we go only back if some spectacular happens. We don't really follow up, and we don't show newsworthy is also the suffering on both sides. in different ways, or what people share as aspirations. But we do this really factual mini-bites. The same is true for the Daesh propaganda, which Dana mentioned as well. If some new Daesh horror propaganda film shows up, we show this most spectacular image, like with the minimum precaution of not showing the beheading itself or so on, but we don't report on the structure of Daesh. We don't give the background. We don't give any context anymore on these issues. And Daesh propaganda is the same as samely polarizing and this effective as this very structurally biased coverage of the Sunni-Shiite divide in Iraq.
Denis.
This is something that we literally saw in Bosnia when we had the conflict. There was huge international media presence there, and it was extremely significant to an amount. I mean, even persons from the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia literally admit that the tribunal would never have been formed if there weren't the big shocking news from Prijedor, from the big concentration camps. Like literally, the media pushed this. But since 1995 until this day, you have nothing. You have no serious presence of the media, and this is because it's not blood. It's not sexy to report on segregation in schools. This is boring for Germans, for British people to read about segregation in Bosnian schools. But it's a big issue, and if not dealt with, you know, in 5 years, in 10 years' time, yesterday, like we have incidents, but they're not 50, they're 1 or 2, but that doesn't mean it can't escalate.
So I think you're suggesting that post-conflict journalism can also fire warning shots for those conflicts not to furtherly escalate or to re-emerge.
Exactly.
I think I have Jakov behind me. He's probably getting some incoming tweets. If sure. I want to give the floor to Jakov.
Global Media Forum is still among the most discussed topics on Twitter in Germany. We are fighting for the 3rd place, although we're
trending
first a couple of hours ago. Furthermore, in South Africa, we are also doing quite well at the 8th place at the moment. So thanks to you all who are using hashtag DW_GMF while sharing thoughts and questions. Bad news is that so-called Islamic State is spamming our hashtag for its propaganda. Luckily, not for long. It looks like Twitter already reacted in the meantime and solved this issue. Anyway, as you can imagine, a lot of tweets and social media content is constantly coming in, so let's mention a few in this round. Richard Stewart asks, how was Iraq a frozen conflict? Is any conflict the West ignores suddenly a frozen one? Rebecca has a question as well. How should journalists report on stories that the public has lost interest in? Do journalists need to hide the truth to promote peace? And also suggests different term for frozen conflicts, saying a frozen conflict isn't frozen for those experiencing it. Forgotten conflict is probably a better term. At the same time, a user called Schifferdecker tweeted, shouldn't we better speak about ignored conflicts, ignored by domestic and foreign media? Adel Sadek is asking, what is the role of social media in the rise of the foreign fighters to coming in the conflict in Middle East, like in Syria and Iraq? Ramon Garcia shared an interesting thought, a big issue here at Global Media Forum, but nobody ever explained what is peace journalism. Mary Lamenche sent to us following question for Denis Dzidic. How do you handle continued tensions between citizens and neighbors? Goal is not to revive tensions. A bit of criticism.
Jakob, can I stop you? Thank you very much. Denis, you've been directly addressed, though I'm not sure if you can answer that question in your competence as a journalist, how you handle these conflicts between neighbors. So let's probably rephrase it a bit and say, like, how do you report on this, and how does it appear in your everyday work?
The challenge in Bosnia is terminology, obviously, because it's so divisive. Whether you call something genocide, a war crime, mass crime, a concentration camp or detention site, all of this is extremely polarizing, and it can be. And if you're not very careful with what you write, if you don't use several sources, if you don't, you can offend people, you can get claims that you're biased, and it is a challenge, and it's something to be very, very sensitive in when you're writing in a post-conflict society. Also, if we're talking more broadly about this, it's really important to do stories which show common things, common losses, This is not to minimize or to say that one side didn't have more casualty than the others. You can mention that, of course, but the important thing is where you start from. And if you start from a position that describes the common things that all people suffered and the common reality that they're living in now, this is something that can certainly bring people together, and something that we had the most positive in BIRN, the most positive results in our work.
And you don't feel...
I think it's quite important in a conflict to describe who is the perpetrator and who suffers. Yeah, and we are not saying, we are not able to say, as I'm coming back to this Osh events 2010, as thousands of Kyrgyz went through the Uzbek neighborhood, and then the Kyrgyz always saying, we didn't do anything. The Uzbek provoked it. And then suddenly the international media the information, had the information capacity to go on the ground and to see it and go inside this Kyrgyz propaganda. And you say, okay, then you always can say, by naming and remembering, then you are inflaming and heating up a conflict. But I think that is our duty somehow.
Let me play this aspect back to this side of the panel. Another dilemma. When we familiarize ourselves with the concepts of peace journalism and let's say the theoretical aspects behind it, we realize that there is always, of course, a lot of social reasons that conflicts don't just erupt, they don't just happen. If we look at like classical war reporting, especially like the old, pundits of war reporting, very often they were fatalists. They were like, people in this part of the world, they kill each other. It happened for thousands of years and it's going on. So, Asiem...
We are beyond this stage, we're really beyond the stage. But we fall into totally other traps. First of all, obviously we need, as mentioned earlier, we need to cover horrible deeds, massacres and so on. But as important is to cover common ground again. And you have the real Bosnian experience of how important this is to show. And we should talk about ethical journalism, which is the term which came after peace journalism, in the sense that ethical journalism also implies notions like grassroots journalism, common ground, common suffering especially, which make people understand, but those people really understand. But there were some more interesting questions in the last tweets, which are related to what you just said. If we only report on blood and on massacres, we create more hatred. Recently, in terms of jihadi propaganda, there's some new psychological studies out based on older psychological wisdom. Films which show violence create violence. Films, as well as for whatever reportage, which give some more peaceful imagery, create more peaceful and calmer people. Jihadi propaganda works through ultra-violence, but the same is said for the polarizing effect of only violent news.
Yeah, but to show jihadi propaganda is not journalistic work. I think that is the biggest mistake, that they broadcast these pictures. They shouldn't do that. That I'm convinced you.
I think this microphone issue, excuse me, I think the easiest thing is if you would leave a couple of microphones open. But I mean, that's what Dana just said. We're not talking about showing jihadi propaganda. The effects are the same. If you show an Iraqi Shiite the massacres committed against them, this automatically creates some violent mental predisposition.
Asiem, you said quite apodictically that peaceful images create peace and violent images create violence. That's also... It's a strong thing to say. We had another question coming in here from the Twitter community about reporting on situations that the public might have lost interest in, and the person that asked this question somehow suggested that the audience is not so much interested in issues other than violent. Is that your experience? And how do we measure? Of course, we can, there's a lot of math to do, But how do we measure this? Let's first say, do you agree with the fact that this doesn't, with the suggestion that this doesn't really interest the audience as much as violence?
I think, honestly, the problem is in journalists themselves who propose these stories that are not, if they can't find an angle that'll interest people. And the problem is that they're making them too vague. They're not addressing an individual. They don't find the story, the one person that it counts that somebody can relate to. And that's a big issue. People have stopped doing that, and you see a lot of stories that focus on numbers, 50 people killed, 20 people killed, and not these stories. For instance, you can do education stories that can be interesting, but you have to give them a chance, and they should be focused on one person where you show it through this example.
Yeah.
I think the violent reporting interesting. I have an experience in my country that violence happened in a series of violence happened when the opposition party, they lead the protests, and then they were cracked down by the government after the election in 2013. So we have like 1 year political deadlock that because of the opposition keep boycott not to join the parliament with the ruling party, and they keep leading people for protesting, and the government, they use armed authority to break them up.
They use what? Sorry.
Armed authority. They use they set up a group of like security guard, but they don't use the gun.
Tear gas. Okay, yeah.
They don't use the gun, but they use like a bamboo stick, and then those group just listen the order of their supervisor or commander or something. So when the group of protesters, like thousands of people protesting in one location or so on, they just comes around and attack, bit like animal. They don't care. We are journalists also got beat up when we cover. Even when the clash happen, sometimes confrontation between the protester and the security. Yes, it got a lot of people try to follow, want to know about what's going on with this, and even the textile industry worker, they protesting as well. They demand their increase of wage or better condition, because condition of working in the textile industry in the country, they consider as one of the poor and was not really in standard.
I want to come back to your point that Marcus mentioned about alliances between international media and local journalists or local media. Even though both have their share in the problem, I want to ask you to bring in some practical solutions and suggestions, because of course frozen conflicts, there are many. Post-conflict societies, there are even more. We don't have the capacities, at least that's what we think, to cover all of this all the time and to pay attention to it all the time. So how do we get out of this dilemma? Aligning with the local media, grassroots journalism, as you mentioned in the beginning, empowering people, what do you call them, not civilian journalists, but citizen journalists to contribute. Is that the solution to this problem?
As we all know, there is no simple solution to this problem. But obviously there's one big paradox. For example, in an increasingly globalized world, we do less and less globalized coverage. I mean, a lot of papers, a lot of not publicly funded news outlets reduce the foreign coverage, and are then surprised of the consequences. And there's big issues, obviously, like media literacy, in a sense that a lot of these transitional societies have a population with a very low degree of media literacy, where we all can do a lot of work. This is just to mention a couple of points. And then obviously it seems to me that we really underestimate also the intelligence of our own public. People are much more interested, I believe, in what happens in foreign countries than we think. I mean, some events, obviously some conflicts, are not going to be bestsellers. For instance, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has been shown in terms of TV ratings, which gets very, very, very low ratings. Nobody wants to watch this eternal conflict anymore. But there are new approaches to cover this kind of long-standing conflicts and to interest viewers. So I think also in the sense we shouldn't underestimate the intelligence and the curiosity of the public.
I agree with that. I think even if you have this discussion now, if you observe how many people really stick to and question articles, asking questions, and we really should be more more open, say, okay, we can deliver it, we can make a job, we can tell a good story, and I'm quite convinced a good story is always interesting, an interesting story. And go out, don't be afraid. And the only thing is what I'm always hate if I was working with German media outlets, made a phone call from Central Asia, and what is the German angle? Yeah. Sometimes there is no German angle, but the story is interesting and important, and we should be more open about that.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up directly on that one. We also can use this tremendous opportunities like the Web 2.0 revolution offers us in terms of cooperation between media. And it's too little done. We can, German lead media, for instance, which would write about, let's say, Libya in a very summary way, could also link it up with all the specialized interest medias. Now, Germany has quite good medias, for example, on the Middle East, like Kantara, but can also point to local news sources so that people can go in depth. You could also do on DVTV, if you want to learn more about it, don't only go to our website, but those guys are quite good on it. And there you might find something out about daily life. So there's some very concrete examples to give more depth to especially also TV coverage, which suffers from its own time constraints and so on. So there are huge opportunities. A couple of papers which really understand themselves as cross-media or as multimedia, for instance, Le Monde in France, gives you direct links to in-depth articles from other outlets to their own archives and all this kind of stuff. And these are very concrete measures which might be very helpful to better understand and not to forget those countries which are still in transition and where no conflict has been frozen.
But Asiem, sorry.
Denis, or you want to... just look.
Really short. You said at the start, like media, you don't have like the capacities to cover everything, and I agree with that. I don't expect every international journalist to come and spend time in Bosnia. But the problem is, and one thing that can be a concrete thing is, a lot of international presence, a lot of international journalists are going to come, for instance, for the 20th anniversary of Srebrenica, and I guarantee you that 50 or 70% of the articles are going to be nonsense or overly simplified, or will focus on what Obama says if he shows up.
Because they will focus, as you predict,
on the German angle, or
on what had happened 20 years ago, trying to find a dramatic approach to what had happened 20 years ago, or because you think people that, for foreign correspondents or reporters, let's say, that travel to Bosnia already know what kind of story, like, that would speak for the structural bias that Asiem just came up with, know what they're going to write and how their story is going to be
I think probably both things. One of the things will be that they will look for some kind of German angle or a US angle, or will probably focus too much on actual atrocities that happened instead of actually explaining how the after effects are influencing the society today, actually going in depth into the stories.
But maybe also because they want to say, hey, this is why this is important for us. This is why it concerns us. They're trying to find a justification to bring it into the paper or to bring it into the
I don't disagree that that should be part of the story. I just disagree with that being the entire story.
Dana.
Yeah, I mean, it's obvious too, like covering a conflict within post-conflict needs really qualified people. One of the problems is we don't have that much of those kind of qualified people in Iraq. I'm not accusing anybody like what you said, you mentioned earlier. But going back to the discussion between Asiem and Marcus, one of the topics which the media is covering with ISIS. They are only, like we talked about this evil part of ISIS, but we never covered the ideology, or the like ISIS is like, there's an ideology, there is an organization. We never ever covered this part of the Islamic states, or always stayed with the evil part, which is on the top, and this is what they are trying to show us. There were one.
I wanted to open the debate now to the audience, unless you have something very important to say before that actually happens.
I think maybe we should also say we journalists are not able to make peace, and we also not creating war.
Thank you for this.
No. We're not really able to make peace, but we often have created war, and this is historically proven. So, yeah. So,
Can you give us an example of
true.
Like journalists creating war? Creating war means like to be at the origin of the war.
You flame it up and you do it. Okay. I mean, we have seen this historically. I'm not talking about contemporary journalism in democratic countries. And even then, you know, I mean, journalism was historically proven, at least flaming up, if not responsible for certain wars. But then there is another very important issue. The undercoverage of countries in transition or in permanent conflict does not only create problems in these countries themselves, it also creates huge problems in terms of policy making in our countries. People simply don't know anymore. They don't know why this is happening in that country and can't make meaningful policy decisions. Which happens quite often when you see...
Do you propose an alliance then between policymakers, journalists, and the NGO world to all serve the same aim, which is making peace? Again, aren't we moving out of character in this endeavor?
I'm not proposing a huge alliance. I'm proposing simply better, more contextualized, and more continuous coverage.
Are we all trying to reinvent the role of journalists because we think that people turn away from classical journalism and we have to find a new role before journalism dies, Markus?
As I'm already told, this media bashing, I somehow try to resist it a little bit, and I think we are not doing our job so bad. And I had a good friend, unfortunately he died. He was a photographer, an American photographer, he covered also the Cambodian War. And he said, you know, sometimes our story changes, sometimes not, but at least we can try. And I think if we stick to this thing and try to be decent with our sources and with our observations, then we are on a good step, on a good road.
To all of you, I started with the quote from by Robert Capa. I have another quote in mind. He once said, I think he was talking about the war in Indochina. He said, "This war is like an old actress. It's getting less and less photogenic and more dangerous." Do you think that with all these wars going on, and 2014 and 2015 are a peak in refugees and war or war-related activity in the world? Do you think it's just like simply going to not to be interesting anymore because there's so much of it that this could contribute to the project of peace journalism? Because people simply lose interest, and this would also influence the media economy?
I think that the problem is not of people losing interest. I think we are really confronted with tremendous challenges. Information technology will evolve in rapid speed. It will open up to major misuse again. Daesh propaganda and their sophisticated pyramid is one example. There will be other examples where these tools can be used in destructive, horrible ways and impact us. So how are we going to react to this? And how are we going to use all these new tools which we have at our disposal to cover countries which directly affect us? Libya is another one of these great examples. So Gaddafi was killed, bombed away, whatever. And now Libya, as a failed state in full conflict, creates partly a refugee crisis in Europe, together with obviously what's happening in the Sahel. Nobody is really prepared. So how long was our attention span on Libya? Everybody, you know, except for people who really knew. So Gaddafi is dead. Some pseudo-democratic elections were held. Parliament was elected. Nobody was interested for Libya anymore until we find out that there is a civil war in Libya. But even the civil war in Libya doesn't really interest us. What interests us are refugee streams and all the horror of people trying to come to Europe. So we see very concrete examples of our journalistic failures as well. Why wasn't Libya continuously covered? Why was nobody warning?
I just talked to a correspondent, reporter this morning who told me that she was already on the way to Libya last fall, and her director grounded her while she was in the taxi to the airport because it was too dangerous. It was considered too dangerous for her to report from there. Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is yours. Please join the debate. You don't have to ask questions. You can also just drop a comment as long as it's short and entertaining. I think the gentleman with the hat was the first to raise his hand. There is a microphone going around. Yeah, for the gentleman here, wearing a black hat. Well, the two of you were at the same time, so you can also start. No, it's fine. You can also start with this gentleman and they were synchronizing.
I would like to stand. All right, my name is Faustini Peter Nyanda. I'm from Tanzania, but I live in Zurich. Well, my question is, what is the balance between the international media with the local media in the countries of concern? Because what I hear from here is that when for example, you said in Bosnia, during the conflict, there was so many international medias reporting on what happened. And after then, they left and nothing was going on. So, my question, the international media, do you give the local media chance? Because when I think about CNN, BBC, DW, Fox News, and all these massive media organizations, how do they provide a chance to the local media? Example, maybe in Tanzania or in Bosnia or in Nigeria, to come up and tell their story by themselves. Because what I see, you tell their story on behalf of them. One example is in Nigeria, Boko Haram. When you go deep inside to find out how this group originated, how it began and come up until is so much big enough to cause incident within our community. You see, there is difference of information, and there is the way you tell the story, and the factual situation of the event is completely different.
And you would say that the people in the country turn towards international media, mass media, rather than if it's there to local media. They pay more attention to what's broadcasted by the big international players than what's reported by the
because the big media, when they go in the country of concern, they broadcast the news, and you have the power to do that. But a local media from Tanzania, do anyone listen or watch to any channel from Tanzania here? Broadcasting on the international stage? And what is the purpose of the international media? Empowering the local media to bring their stories and tell the reality and the truth.
I just heard you mention the BBC, DW, CNN, and Fox News as one group. But thank you. Markus, would you like to answer that question?
I think there is the international news are not pushing away the local media. That is the opposite. As much international coverage you have, as more chances the local journalists have the possibility to develop. And the biggest problem, if you do not have an international coverage, I saw it, for example, this example in South Kyrgyzstan, there you have this partisan journalist from Uzbek covering Uzbek, Kyrgyz covering the Kyrgyz issue, but it's for them really difficult if no international coverage is there to get away from their blaming game.
I think, you know what, Denis was addressed directly.
I'll be really brief. I just wanted to say that it's also probably an issue of audiences. You know, personally working for Bosnia and working sometimes in English, we have both versions for regional and local. It's a context issue. You know, if you're writing locally, there's not so much need to go into all of the details explaining what happened. People already know, and so I wouldn't find it necessarily. I agree with you. I wouldn't find it necessarily in a clash. You know, it can exist either way.
The gentleman just behind him, yeah, with the green jacket. I think he was next. Who else? Can I see your hands again? Okay, 1, 2, 3, and 4. All right.
Yes, actually, in my experience, it's the exact opposite. That there's actually too much reliance by international media in places that are perpetually in frozen conflicts, like parts of, say, Nigeria. There's too much reliance on stringers and all of that. You know, international journalists come, they stay in hotels and they phone up their stringers. And somebody's in Lagos, he's reporting on a conflict in Maiduguri that is as far as, say, I don't know, the Czech Republic from Israel. And then he's reporting, I'm live in Lagos, but he's reporting in Maiduguri, calling up a stringer, someone like me on the ground, and you feed him information, and he's live on air. So I think, just to say, I think it's the exact opposite, especially in many parts of, certainly, Nigeria. It's also interesting, I see, to the whole talk about standards and how international journalists should act. Why it's interesting for me to listen to, especially the gentleman, the first gentleman here, is that, you know, standards drop as you come down to Africa. It's almost like an agreed thing. You know, it's just that thing, 2 seconds bit, so it's not really important what you do. And so, for example, if you look at the coverage of the Nigerian elections, a lot of journalists, they had this fatalistic approach to the elections, and they were just coming to watch conflict. And I had journalists from Sweden who said to me, oh, please, you know, give me a heads up if there's anything going to happen. So he just booked a hotel for 2 nights, flew in from Sweden, waiting for a war to happen. And when there was no war, he packed his bags and he left. You know, so there wasn't any sexy conflict to report during the elections. And a lot of them were disappointed. You could see that they all came, a few of them came with bulletproof vests and all of that. You know, they wanted to see this. So I think that it's not so much sometimes about context, it's also about how important people see areas like this. Of course, for people like us, it's sad that nuance disappears as you come down to places like Africa. I mean, even here, someone has referred to someone here as an African, which is really, for someone like me, very offensive. That maybe someone from Libya can say, oh, I'm from Libya, and then he says to the other guy, that African fellow, you know, as though we're not all Africans. And at a media conference, you can say that, and nobody raises. So, just one final thing, I'm from Nigeria. It's a country in that big thing called Africa. Thank you.
That wasn't so short, but it was very interesting. I think I have the lady here on the second row, and then the gentleman with his laptop, and then 3, 4.
Just 2 observations or maybe a comment. We have been having this discussion about bleeding is leading and so on and so forth since this morning. And I honestly think that it is a trend that if a country is not bleeding, it's not sexy anymore. So you pull out your correspondents from that particular country and you put them somewhere else where the news is coming. But also on a positive note, after listening to all this discussion, I think all of us as people coming from media are aware that there is this problem, that we are not consistently reporting on a particular topic. But what I am missing in this entire discussion is changing consumption patterns on the receiver's end, the people who consume our news. And the current generation, they really need news on the go. You know, you pick up a coffee and you take it on the go. So they need news on the go. And we, I think, need to develop a kind of news pattern where we can provide this consistent reporting, but also on the go. So maybe in 178 characters on Twitter, but consistent reporting on a particular topic. So that was just a comment.
Thank you. Asiem, do you want to comment on the comment?
Yeah, I want to comment on two comments. So in terms of international cooperation, in terms of relying on local media, that's a huge opportunity if you can identify reliable local media, in a sense, which keep up certain standards of reporting. And this will be a future topic, which I said earlier on, you know, some of the corporations are in place, but especially new technology allows us to do international cooperation and link media, international media with reliable and high quality local media. And this will be definitely enriching the whole coverage. And this also goes to the last comment, in a sense that you're saying, you know, and Deutsche Welle is not too bad at that, I must say, in terms of thinking about new technologies. Again, you can do a Twitter feed, and like a lot of our colleagues do, and the Twitter feed leads us to something which goes much deeper. So all this cross-media thing will really be a big laboratory for everybody else. In terms of Nigeria and the stringing issue, you know, I think in this more globalized world, we don't do global coverage. I think we should be together quite shameful, and especially like a lot of commercial or not so commercial leading media in Europe or the Western world, which really have no deep interest in profound coverage, fly somebody in for 2 days. That's basically just shameful, and I don't know how to change it, but let's hope that in some ways it can be changed, especially in Nigeria, who is one of the biggest population-wise African country, concerns us not only through Boko Haram, so there's no easy answer, but I personally I don't understand why the West, who is the leading engine behind globalization, doesn't really invest in media able to cope with enough challenges. At this stage, for example, which we all feel, Daniel and me, we don't have enough specialists for the Arab world. So it's only the same guys who appear at some TV show and comment on the Arab world, or the same guys who speak about jihadism, or the same guys who are consulted.
That doesn't mean that you're not supposed to invite us anymore.
So there's a structural issue in terms of knowledge about the outside world. And last word, and then I'll stop. Africa is not sexy for an audience. And this has been proven. That's why Africa never appears. It's as unsexy or more unsexy as the Israeli-Palestine conflict. It's a real audience killer. And this is another shame of the Western world.
We should partly stop caring about what is an audience killer or whatnot. The gentleman with his laptop. Here. I would like just remind you of the sad fact that we have something like 4 to 5 minutes left.
Really?
Otherwise, the steamboat is going to leave without us.
First of all, I would like to thank all the speakers for a really interesting discussion here. I'm coming from Azerbaijan. I'm also working in the conflict issues, especially on Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. I have just few comments. I will try to be brief, especially as some of the speakers mentioned, I am really against to use the frozen conflicts, especially in post-Soviet areas. I did my master in peace and conflict studies. I never see any kind of academic term which is called frozen conflict. I think this term comes from the medias or some, let's say, experts coming from the journalism using this frozen conflict. Let's say, if there are happenings, lots of humanitarian loss every day or every week or every month on the conflict, how we can call this frozen conflict? Maybe it would be better to call the frozen process or frozen negotiation process of the conflict, not frozen conflict. Let's say in Uppsala conflict database, they call that, okay, if there is at least 25 battle-related deaths, it's ongoing conflict. It's not frozen conflict.
Okay, Whatever we call it, we all agree that the fact that it's frozen or whatever it is called doesn't mean that nothing happens.
Yes.
And we should.
This is my comments. I'm sorry. I don't blame or I don't accuse anyone. But this is a personal approach. And regarding to the peace journalism or journalism, I would really recommend to some international media outlets like Deutsche Welle to cooperate with local news outlets, because what we see in international media outlets, they have really theoretical backgrounds, but when it comes to the real news, they lack it. But when it comes to local media outlets, they have they have really pure information or news about the situation in these countries, but they don't have a professionalism. I think they have to think, I mean the international media outlets, to think about this.
I think Markus would not entirely agree.
Also I think, yes, we have to cooperate with the knowledge, but you coming from Azerbaijan, you're having this long-time forgotten conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, yeah? And if you speak to a local correspondent from Armenia or from Azerbaijan, we get two different stories. And that is a duty and a demand for us to find in this two diverse perspective the reality and to describe the reality. And I think having this Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenian and Azerbaijan perspective on it, that is like black and white. Yeah.
Sorry, we're running out of time. The lady in blue here at the first row.
Thank you very much. My name is Vanya Ivanova, and originally I'm from Bulgaria. For me, it was very important to listen to you because I'm not a mediator. But one of the most important issues for me is when we look back to the Second World War, the First World War, we really learn from the media that you are a real actor in everything what we build, the history. You have kind of shared responsibility of the peacemaking, of the good governance, of transparency, of the local, let's say, dialogue building, of also you're an actor. And I think that one of the issues which I'm missing is here the educational or participatory role. Why you do that reporting is for the future generations, that we can leave this audience and we learn from each other that reporting is about shared responsibility, and that we actors learn from you and you learn from international conflicts not to repeat them back. And exactly this is the rights of the next generation to have something better.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The gentleman in the third row. Last comment or remark. Sorry for all the others.
You have to hold it.
Okay. On the other side.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to ask this question. I'm George Alul. I'm coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo, but I live in Washington, D.C. I have one remark to the press and media people. If you look at the theater war around the world, it seems to me like we're going to a World War IV, because the World War III already happened in Africa. 6 countries fight around the DRC. Now you see in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, in Asia, everywhere you have a kind of theater of war. My question is, it looks like every September in New York, most of the head of the state get together to solve or to look at world issue. My suggestion, why don't we have people on any kind of race, religion, get together somewhere in the world to say what bothering them from other community and to try to build together a kind of peace, not to put us in a position to go from one conflict to another one, having journalists killed in the field of conflicts during our lifetime. This is something that I try to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't think this was a question. This was a statement that we're all going to take home. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It was my first time as in the role of a moderator for Deutsche Welle. I've been with Brian in the studio several times being interviewed, and I don't envy you always for this role of trying to, challenge the interviewees at the same time, somehow be concise and precise and short and making the news newsworthy. Usually as a moderator, you just roll out the red carpet, you try not to be smarter than the people that you're talking to, and then you go home and you're happy and you hope that everybody enjoyed the debate. I want to, with the permission of Deutsche Welle and Robert Bosch Stiftung, just draw your attention to a media project that I represent myself, because Zenith magazine is a magazine reporting on the Middle East and on the wider Muslim world, and we're trying to do exactly this. We're trying to, somehow report in a foresighting way, which we are trying to foresee conflicts, and we're trying to, cover issues that are not covered by the news every day, and we are crowdfunding this year, and you can all support us on Twitter. We are trying to create a thunderclap, which is a crowdsourcing tool on Twitter. So Zenith MENA News, you can follow us, you can support us. We are also going to be crowding on Start Next this summer, and we are trying to bring in some alternative reporting to this very complex and probably even getting more complex world. Thank you very much, panelists. Thank you very much, dear guests. And I think the weather is stable. I'm looking forward to see you on the steamship. And good evening to all of you.
And as we get ready to move the conversation onto the boat, a little information about where the boat is. It'd be very important. It's right back here. I've been told you could get on by exits right behind the building. Thank you so much all for being here. Tomorrow, we pick it up with Diplomacy in 140 Characters. It's been a beautiful start to the conference. Enjoy yourself. My colleague Terry Martin will be taking over tomorrow. So I'm saying goodbye and thank you.